The fog rolled thick through the Cumberland Gap on the morning they found Samuel's body. It clung to the pine needles like wet cotton, muffling sound, turning the world into a grey dream where only the worst things felt real. Jacob Turner had been riding patrol for 6 years, and he'd seen his share of horrors. Runaways beaten to pulp, overseers gored by mules, even a planter's son who'd hanged himself in his daddy's barn. But what lay in the clearing ahead made his hands shake so badly he nearly dropped his rifle. Samuel Hayes had been a free man, had the papers to prove it, signed by a Quaker family up in Pennsylvania who'd manumitted his father 20 years back. He'd come down to Tennessee to work as a blacksmith, married a Cherokee woman named Ahyoka in a quiet ceremony that most white folks pretended not to notice. The Cherokees who remained after the removal had learned to make themselves small, invisible. Samuel had learned the same trick, keeping his head down, his hammer swinging, his papers folded in his breast pocket where he could reach them quick if a patroller got curious. The papers hadn't saved him. Jacob dismounted slowly, his boots squelching in mud that was darker than it should be. The smell hit him then. Copper and meat left too long in summer heat, though it was only April and the morning still carried frost. Samuel's body lay spread-eagled between 2 oak trees, arms stretched wide like he was trying to embrace the sky, except his arms ended at the elbows and his legs at the knees. The stumps had been cauterized with fire, the flesh blackened and cracked. His torso was a canvas of knife-work, patterns carved deep enough to show rib bone, but it was his face that made Jacob turn away and vomit into the ferns. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. They'd left his eyes open, sewn them open with thread so fine it looked like spider silk. His mouth was frozen in a scream that had probably lasted hours. Jesus Christ! Tom Wardell, Jacob's partner, had gone pale as milk. Jesus Christ, who does this? Probably ran. Jacob wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. They always run eventually. Think being free up north makes them free everywhere. He tried to sound casual, authoritative, but his voice cracked on the last word. The truth was, Samuel Hayes hadn't run. Everyone knew that. He'd been taken from his forge in broad daylight 3 days ago by the Benson brothers, Wade and Coleman, who ran a side trade in recruitment for the deeper South plantations. They'd take free blacks, destroy their papers, and sell them down to Mississippi or Alabama, where nobody asked questions, and a strong back was worth more than any certificate from Pennsylvania. It was illegal, technically. But technically didn't mean much this far from Nashville, and the Bensons paid their percentage to the county sheriff. "We need to find the wife," Tom said. "Cherokee woman, right? She'll know something." Jacob nodded, though he didn't relish the prospect. He'd seen Ahyoka exactly twice, once at the market in Knoxville, buying cornmeal with coins she counted out carefully, and once outside the forge, watching her husband work with an expression of such pure contentment it had made Jacob uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate. Cherokee women were supposed to be soft, beaten down by history. This one had carried herself like a queen inspecting her kingdom. They wrapped Samuel's remains in canvas and loaded them onto Tom's horse. The animal skittered and rolled its eyes, smelling death and something else, something wild that made it want to bolt. Jacob had to blindfold it before it would move. The forge stood at the edge of Greenville, where the town gave way to forest. It was a modest structure, stone foundation and pine walls, with a chimney that usually sent up a steady column of smoke. Today it was cold. The door hung open, moving slightly in the wind that whispered down from the mountains. "Mrs. Hayes!" Jacob called from outside, rifle ready though he felt foolish, pointing it at an empty doorway. "Ahyoka Hayes, we need to speak with you." Silence. Not even birds singing. That was wrong, Jacob realized. The spring migration had started, and normally the woods were full of sound this time of morning. Now there was nothing but wind and the creak of the door on its leather hinges. They found her inside, sitting at a table with her hands folded in front of her. She was younger than Jacob had thought, maybe 25, with long black hair that fell straight to her waist and eyes the color of creek water over stone. She wore a simple dress of blue homespun, and her feet were bare despite the chill. "Mrs. Hayes," Jacob said, removing his hat, "I'm afraid I have terrible news." "I know." Her voice was steady, unaccented except for a slight rounding of the vowels. "I felt him leave 3 nights ago. I felt him suffer. I felt him die." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, we found your husband's body up on—" "I know where you found him." She looked at Tom then, and he took an involuntary step backward. Her eyes weren't crying, weren't even red. They were clear and cold and absolutely certain. The Benson brothers took him. They destroyed his freedom papers. They chained him to a wagon, and when he fought back, when he showed them his papers and demanded they let him go, Wade Benson took a hammer and broke every bone in his hands. Then they amused themselves. They took their time. Jacob's mouth had gone dry. "How do you know?" "Because I tracked them." She stood, and Jacob saw she was taller than he'd realized, almost 6 feet, with the kind of lean strength that came from a lifetime of physical work. "I followed them for 2 days. I watched them from the ridgeline while they did what they did. I listened to my husband scream my name, and when they finally tired of their sport and killed him, I watched them laugh about it over their campfire. I heard Wade say that Samuel had squealed like a pig. I heard Coleman say they should do this more often, that it was better than a whorehouse." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Tom's hand drifted to his pistol, but Jacob grabbed his wrist and shook his head fractionally. Something was very wrong here, something that went beyond grief or shock. "Oh, why didn't you come to town?" Jacob asked carefully. "Why didn't you report it?" Ahyoka smiled then, and it was the most terrible thing Jacob had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or mocking. It was simply empty, a hole where human emotion should be, filled with something else entirely. "Report it to whom? To the sheriff who takes money from the Bensons? To the judge who sent my people west to die?" She walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that rose like purple shadows in the distance. "My husband was a good man. He believed in your laws, your papers, your civilization. He believed that being right would protect him. Being legal would protect him." She turned back, and now her eyes reflected the dim light like an animal's. "I will not make his mistake." "Now hold on," Tom started, but she cut him off. "Leave now. Go back to town. Tell them you found Samuel's body. Tell them you spoke to his widow. Tell them I am grieving, if that comforts you." She moved to the door, holding it open. The wind had picked up, bringing with it the smell of pine and something else, something musky and wild. "But do not come back here. Do not send anyone else. The next person who crosses my threshold uninvited will not leave it alive." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. Jacob found himself moving toward the door without consciously deciding to, Tom right behind him. Outside, their horses were panicking. Tom's mount had broken its tether and bolted 10 yards away, eyes rolling white. Jacob's was rearing and screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure terror. He managed to grab the reins and vault into the saddle, and Tom did the same. And then they were riding hard back toward town, neither man speaking, neither man willing to acknowledge what they'd felt in that house. Behind them, Ahyoka stood in her doorway and watched them go. When they were out of sight, she closed the door and barred it. She moved through the house methodically, gathering supplies, a knife, a hatchet, rope, dried venison, a water skin. She took Samuel's bow from above the fireplace, the one he'd made for her when they'd first married, teaching her to shoot with a patience that had made her love him even more. She took his quiver of arrows, each one fletched with hawk feathers he'd gathered himself. Then she walked to the bedroom and opened the chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were the things she'd hidden away when she'd married Samuel, the things she'd tried to forget. Her mother's ceremonial dress, dyed red with pokeweed and adorned with porcupine quills, her father's war club, the stone head still stained with Spanish blood from a raid 60 years past. And at the bottom, wrapped in deer hide, the medicine bag her grandmother had given her the night before the soldiers came to take them west. Ahyoka had been 12 years old, hiding in a root cellar while her family was rounded up at bayonet point. Her grandmother had found her there, had pressed the bag into her hands and whispered words in the old language, words that Ahyoka hadn't understood then, but had never forgotten. When the world breaks you, break it back. The forest will answer if you know how to ask. Blood calls to blood, and the old things never truly die. She opened the bag now. Inside was a mixture of herbs she couldn't name, a bone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and a small clay pot sealed with beeswax. She broke the seal and inhaled. The smell was thick and wrong, like rotting leaves and fresh blood mixed together. Her head swam, and for a moment she saw double, the bedroom overlaid with a forest clearing, moonlight streaming through branches that moved through there was no wind. Ahyoka drank the contents of the pot. It burned going down, burned like swallowing hot coals, and she doubled over, gasping. Her vision went dark, then too bright, colors bleeding into each other until the world was a smear of sensation without meaning. She felt her body convulsing on the floor, felt something inside her tearing loose and rearranging itself. When she opened her eyes again, it was dusk. She'd lost hours, but she wasn't tired. She was humming with energy, every sense heightened to an almost painful degree. She could hear mice in the walls, could smell the deer that had passed through the yard at midday, could feel the vibration of footsteps in town nearly a mile away. And she could hear, distant but growing closer, the sound of wolves howling in the mountains. Ahyoka rose and dressed in her mother's ceremonial clothing. She painted her face with ash and red clay, the old patterns her grandmother had worn, symbols of death and retribution. She took up the bow, slung the quiver across her back, and walked out into the gathering darkness. The wolves were waiting at the tree line. 7 of them, all male, all grey as smoke. They were larger than normal wolves, their eyes intelligent in a way that was distinctly unnatural. The pack leader approached her slowly, head lowered in submission, and Ahyoka reached out to touch its massive skull. She felt the connection snap into place like a key turning in a lock, their minds brushing against hers, their loyalty absolute. "We hunt," she said in Cherokee, and the wolves understood. They melted into the forest together, woman and pack, moving north toward the trails where the slave traders traveled, toward the men who had killed her husband, toward justice that would be written in blood and terror. In Greenville, Jacob Turner sat in the tavern nursing a whiskey he didn't want. His hands still shook when he thought about Ahyoka's eyes, about the certainty in her voice. Tom had gone straight home to his wife, had locked the doors and loaded his rifle and refused to talk about what they'd seen. "Something's coming," Jacob muttered into his drink. The bartender, a fat man named Horace, looked at him questioningly. "What's that?" Jacob shook his head. "Nothing, just talking to myself." But he wasn't. He was listening to the wind that had started up outside, howling down from the mountains, like the voice of something ancient and angry, something that had been sleeping and was now awake. In the morning, they would find the first bodies. By the end of the week, the whole county would be talking about the Cherokee woman and her wolves. Within a month, the slave trade through eastern Tennessee would grind to a halt, the traders too terrified to venture onto the roads after dark. But that first night, Ahyoka and her pack found the Benson brothers camped in a hollow 3 miles north of town. They had a fire going, had 2 bottles of whiskey between them, and were laughing about something. They had a wagon with them, and in that wagon were 3 black men in chains, faces swollen with beatings, eyes hollow with the knowledge of what awaited them south. Ahyoka notched an arrow and waited for the wolves to circle into position. She thought of Samuel's hands, broken and useless. She thought of his screams echoing through the forest while she watched, paralyzed by the knowledge that revealing herself meant dying with him. She would not be paralyzed again. The first arrow took Wade Benson through the throat. He stood up, clutching at the shaft, blood spraying between his fingers, making a wet, gurgling sound. Coleman grabbed for his rifle, but the wolves were already moving, grey shadows erupting from the darkness, with teeth bared and eyes reflecting firelight like demons. What happened next would be debated in hushed conversations for years to come. Some said the wolves tore the Bensons apart in seconds. Others claimed the Cherokee woman took her time, that the screaming lasted until dawn. The truth lay somewhere in between, and Ahyoka would never speak of it to anyone. When it was done, she freed the 3 men in the wagon and pointed them north. They stared at her with a mixture of terror and reverence, then ran without looking back. She took the Bensons' rifles, their ammunition, their horses. She stripped them of their boots and coats and left their bodies where they lay, food for the carrion birds. Then she carved words into the largest oak tree at the edge of the clearing, using the same knife Wade Benson had used on Samuel. The words were in Cherokee, but their meaning would be understood by anyone who saw them in any language. The forest remembers. News traveled fast in eastern Tennessee, but fear traveled faster. By the time the sun rose on the 2nd day after the Benson brothers vanished, half the county knew something had gone wrong. The brothers had been expected in Knoxville to deliver their cargo, 3 strong men worth at least $2,000 total, but they'd never arrived. A search party found their camp around midday, and what they discovered there sent 2 men running for the trees to vomit, and a third into a babbling silence that would last the rest of his life. Sheriff Marcus Pritchard stood in the clearing, chewing the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood. He was a thick-necked man of 50, with a drinker's nose and the kind of face that looked perpetually angry, even when he was sleeping. Right now, he wasn't sleeping, and he was genuinely angry, though the anger was tinged with something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. "What in the goddamn hell?" he said to no one in particular. What remained of Wade Benson was scattered across 20 square feet of torn earth. His brother Coleman was in even worse shape, if that was possible. The wolves had been methodical, almost surgical in their savagery. Major organs and arteries first, ensuring death came quick despite the violence. Then they'd gone to work on the extremities, tearing and worrying at flesh until bone showed white through the carnage. But it was the staging that unsettled Pritchard most. The bodies had been arranged, Wade's torso propped against a log, Coleman's head placed carefully on a flat rock like an offering. And surrounding them in a perfect circle were paw prints, each one pressed deep into the mud, each one belonging to an animal far larger than any natural wolf. "Count them," Pritchard ordered his deputy, a nervous young man named William Sykes. Sykes crouched by the tracks, his face the color of old paper. "7, sir. 7 distinct sets of prints, all circling the camp. But, Sheriff, these aren't normal. Look at the size. These would be from wolves weighing 200 pounds or more. That doesn't happen. That can't happen." Pritchard had already noticed. He'd hunted these mountains his entire life and knew what wolf tracks looked like. These were wrong in every dimension, as if someone had taken a normal wolf and scaled it up by half again. And then there was the tree. The massive oak at the clearing's edge bore fresh carvings, the bark peeled back in careful strips to reveal pale wood underneath. Cherokee symbols, written in the syllabary script that Sequoia had created decades ago. Pritchard couldn't read it, but he knew someone who could. "Get John Ross," he said. "Sir, Ross lives 40 miles. I don't care if he lives in goddamn Mexico. Get him. We need to know what this says." Pritchard turned in a slow circle, taking in the trampled grass, the scattered supplies, the rifle, Wade's expensive percussion cap rifle, broken into 3 pieces and laid out like a dismantled puzzle. And find out where that Cherokee woman is, the one married to the freed black we found earlier this week. You think she did this? Sykes sounded skeptical. Sir, with respect, she's one woman. This looks like exactly what everyone in 5 counties will be talking about by sunset, Pritchard interrupted. A Cherokee woman with a pack of demon wolves, killing white men in their sleep. You think that story helps us? You think that keeps the roads safe and the trade moving? He spat into the dirt. Find her. Bring her in for questioning. If she resists, bring her in anyway. But Ahyoka was already gone, vanished into the mountains like smoke in wind. Her forge stood empty, door swinging open to reveal a space stripped of everything personal. The house was similarly bare. No clothes, no food stores, no indication that anyone had lived there beyond the basic furniture Samuel had built. Only one thing remained, and Deputy Sykes found it when he checked the bedroom. On the wall above where the bed had been, written in what looked like charcoal mixed with something darker, were more Cherokee words. These had been painted in broad strokes, each letter a foot high, the message unmistakable even without translation. When John Ross finally arrived 3 days later, a dignified man in his 60s who'd somehow survived the Trail of Tears and maintained his position as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation despite exile and betrayal, he read both inscriptions without expression. Then he looked at Sheriff Pritchard with eyes that had seen the worst of what white civilization could offer. The tree says, "The forest remembers," Ross explained quietly. The wall says, "I am the remembering." It's a declaration, a promise, or possibly a curse, depending on your perspective. What's that supposed to mean? Pritchard demanded. It means she's not finished. Ross turned to face the sheriff fully. I knew Ahyoka's grandmother, a medicine woman, one of the last who kept the old knowledge. They said she could speak to animals, could make plants grow where nothing should live, could curse a man so his own shadow turned against him. Superstition mostly, but every superstition has a seed of truth. He paused, choosing his words carefully. After the removal, after the soldiers took almost everyone west and thousands died on the road, some of us who remained made a choice. We would forget. We would learn your language, wear your clothes, marry in your churches, become civilized, whatever that means. We would survive by erasing ourselves. Get to the point, Pritchard growled. The point, Sheriff, is that some things cannot be erased. Some wounds are too deep to heal. And when you corner something wounded deeply enough, it stops running and starts biting. Ross gestured at the surrounding forest, the mountains rising blue and infinite in every direction. These are her mountains. Her people walked these ridges for 1,000 years before your people arrived. She knows every hollow, every cave, every game trail. And if the stories are true, if her grandmother taught her the old medicine, then she has resources you cannot comprehend and cannot fight. It's wolves, Pritchard said flatly. Big wolves, I grant you, but still just animals. We'll hunt them down like any other predator. Post a bounty, get some experienced trappers. $5,000, a new voice interrupted. They turned to see Henry Carver approaching through the trees, flanked by 2 armed men. Carver was a planter from down near Chattanooga, owner of 300 acres and twice that many slaves. He was also the largest investor in the slave trading network that moved human cargo from Virginia to the Deep South. The Benson brothers had worked for him. $5,000, Carver repeated, for the Cherokee woman's head, and another 1,000 for every wolf killed. I want this ended, Pritchard. The Bensons were employees of mine, and this attack on them was an attack on my business interests. His face was red with anger, jowls quivering. These mountains need to learn that you don't kill white men without consequences. Ross said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. Pritchard felt caught between forces he didn't fully understand, the law he was sworn to uphold, the economic interests of men like Carver, and something older and darker that seemed to be waking in the forests around them. I'll put out the word, he said finally. "But Mr. Carver, you should know. There's talk in town. People are scared. Some are saying this is justice, that the Bensons got what they deserve for what they did to that freed black man." "I don't care about talk," Carver snapped. "I care about results. Hunt her down, make an example, or I'll find someone who will." That night, as Pritchard sat in his office trying to draft a wanted poster for a woman whose full name he didn't know and whose appearance he could barely describe, the first of the hunters rode out. They were mountain men mostly, trappers and trackers who knew the high country and had hunted everything from deer to black bear. 3 groups of 4 men each, well-armed and confident, following different routes into the wilderness. 2 days later, the first group came back minus 1 man. They'd been camped in a ravine near the Little Pigeon River when the attack came. No warning, just sudden violence erupting from the darkness. Wolves the size of ponies, they said, with eyes that gleamed with unnatural intelligence, and behind them, directing them like a general commands troops, the Cherokee woman in her red dress painted with symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. She didn't say a word, the group's leader, a grizzled trapper named Dutch Hamilton, reported. His hands shook as he accepted the whiskey Pritchard offered. Just stood there with her bow, putting arrows into anyone who tried to run. Jim Thompson took one through the spine, dropped him instantly. The wolves were on him before he hit the ground. We returned fire, but she just melted into the trees like she was made of shadow. Then the wolves pulled back too, and we were alone with Jim's body and the sound of her laughing somewhere out in the dark. "Laughing," Pritchard repeated. "Not like joy. Like something that used to be human, remembering what joy sounded like and getting it wrong." Dutch drained his glass and stood up. "I'm done. Keep your bounty. Whatever that thing is out there, it ain't worth 5,000 or 5 million. It ain't even worth my life." The second group never came back at all. Searchers found their camp a week later, eerily intact, except for the complete absence of people. Bedrolls laid out neatly, fire pit cold, but arranged as if someone had been cooking, rifles propped against a log. No blood, no signs of struggle. No bodies, just emptiness and paw prints circling the site like a predator marking territory. The third group made it back physically intact, but mentally shattered. They'd seen her, they claimed. Seen her standing on a ridgeline at dawn, with her pack arrayed around her like courtiers attending a queen. One of the men swore she'd been holding a human femur like a staff. Another said the wolves had been eating something that looked suspiciously like a human torso. When Pritchard pressed for details, all 4 men began talking at once, their stories contradicting and supporting each other in equal measure until the sheriff couldn't separate truth from trauma-induced fantasy. What was clear? No one else would hunt her, not for 5,000, not for 10. The bounty sat unclaimed, and the roads through the mountains became increasingly deserted as word spread, and the killings continued. A patrol of slave catchers found their dogs slaughtered, each one laid out in a star pattern with their throats opened. The men ran without looking back, abandoning their horses and equipment. A trader moving a coffled group of enslaved people through the hills woke to find his chains cut and his cargo gone, vanished into the forest. He and his 2 assistants were tied to trees and left alive, but painted from head to toe in symbols they couldn't read, marked like cattle with messages they couldn't understand. A plantation overseer known for particular cruelty to his charges was found in his own barn, hanging from the rafters in a way that looked like suicide until someone noticed his hands were tied behind his back and his mouth was sewn shut with sinew. Each scene was the same, the massive paw prints circling and circling, the Cherokee words carved into nearby trees, and an absence of witnesses. Those few who claimed to have seen anything described a woman who moved like water, whose arrows never missed, whose wolves obeyed her slightest gesture. She became a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a myth made flesh. The enslaved people being moved through the region began whispering different stories. They said she was a liberator, an angel of vengeance. They said she watched the roads and freed anyone she could, sending them north with supplies and directions to safe houses. They said if you saw grey wolves at sunset, you were being protected. If you heard a woman singing Cherokee songs at midnight, justice was coming for your oppressors. Ahyoka heard none of these stories. She lived in the mountains now, moving from cave to cave, from hollow to ridge. Her pack always with her. She hunted men who bought and sold human beings, and she hunted them methodically, studying their roots and habits, learning their names and faces. Each one she killed felt like balancing scales that would never truly level, but needed to be weighed nonetheless. She thought of Samuel constantly, his gentle hands, his patient teaching, his belief in goodness that the world had beaten out of him in the worst possible way. She had loved him completely, and that love had made her vulnerable, had made her believe in the possibility of peace within a system built on violence. She would not make that mistake again. The wolves sensed her moods, responding to grief and rage in equal measure. They were no longer quite wolves, having eaten of the medicine she'd mixed into their food, herbs and compounds her grandmother had described, things that changed animals in ways that defied natural law. They were bigger, smarter, more vicious. They were extensions of her will. One evening, as autumn began painting the mountains in blood reds and dying golds, she sat by a fire in a cave high above the valley. Below, she could see the lights of Greenville, could hear the distant sounds of civilization, dogs barking, someone playing a fiddle, the general murmur of human activity. She felt separate from it now, removed. Not quite human anymore, but not fully what she was becoming either. The pack leader, she'd named him Ghost for his silver-white coat, lay with his massive head in her lap. She stroked his fur absently, her other hand resting on the bough that never left her side. "They fear me now," she said aloud in Cherokee, knowing the wolves understood even if they couldn't respond in words. Fear is useful. Fear keeps the trade away. Fear protects those who cannot protect themselves. Ghost made a low rumbling sound, somewhere between growl and purr. "But fear is not justice," she continued. "Fear is not retribution, and it is not enough." She thought about Henry Carver, the man who'd ordered the bounty on her head. He was the source, the fountainhead from which so much suffering flowed. Men like the Bensons were symptoms. Men like Carver were the disease itself. Ahyoka stood, and the wolves rose with her, 7 shadows moving as one. She looked down at the valley one last time, committing its lights and sounds to memory. Then she turned toward the south, toward Chattanooga, toward the plantation where Henry Carver slept, in comfort bought with the blood and sweat of people he didn't consider human. "We hunt," she said simply, and the pack moved out into the darkness. A tide of fur and fang, an ancient fury made manifest. The war had begun, but she intended to be the one who finished it. Henry Carver's plantation sat on a rise overlooking the Tennessee River. 300 acres of prime cotton land worked by 217 enslaved people whose names he didn't know and whose faces he rarely saw. The main house was a monument to wealth extracted from suffering. White pillars, wraparound veranda, French windows that caught the light at sunset and turned the whole structure golden. Inside were Persian rugs, imported furniture, a wine cellar stocked with vintages from Bordeaux. Carver had built his empire on cotton and human cargo, and he slept well at night in a bedroom larger than the cabins that housed entire families of his workers. He was sleeping well on the night Ahyoka arrived, dreaming of expansion, of new markets opening in Texas, of the railroad that would soon connect Chattanooga to Atlanta and make his fortune even greater. He did not dream of debts or consequences. Men like Carver never did. The wolves came first, as they always did. 7 grey shadows drifting through the cotton fields like fog made solid, weaving between the rows with supernatural silence. The plantation dogs, 3 mastiffs bred for size and aggression, trained to attack runaways, caught the scent and began barking, the sound sharp and panicked in the pre-dawn darkness. They charged forward, 200 pounds of muscle and tooth expecting easy prey. They were dead within seconds. Ghost took the alpha by the throat and shook once, snapping the dog's neck with casual efficiency. The other 2 wolves moved in concert, hamstringing the remaining mastiffs and leaving them thrashing in the dirt. No howling, no prolonged struggle, just swift violence and the sudden absence of barking that was somehow louder than the noise had been. In the overseer's cabin at the edge of the property, Luther Vance woke to silence where there should have been commotion. He was a hard man, made harder by his profession, with scarred knuckles and a face like dried leather. He kept a loaded shotgun by his bed and a bullwhip hanging on the wall, both tools of his trade. He'd been overseeing Carver's plantation for 8 years and had earned his salary by ensuring maximum productivity through maximum brutality. He grabbed the shotgun and opened his door carefully. The pre-dawn light was grey and uncertain, turning the world into a sketch of itself. Nothing moved in the yard. No dogs barking, no insects chirping. Even the wind had died, leaving a stillness that felt wrong. "Boss?" he called out, voice carrying toward the slave quarters. No response. 300 yards away, the big house sat silent and dark except for a single lamp burning in an upstairs window, Carver's bedroom. Everything looked normal. Everything felt utterly wrong. Vance stepped onto his porch, shotgun raised, scanning the cotton fields. That's when he saw them, paw prints in the dust, each one the size of a dinner plate, leading from the fields toward the big house in a straight line that spoke of purpose rather than random wandering. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and started running toward the main house, shouting as he went. "Mr. Carver! Mr. Carver, wake up! We got wolves!" Behind him from the slave quarters, faces appeared in windows and doorways, people who'd learned to sleep light and wake ready, who'd survived by knowing when danger was coming and how to avoid it. They watched Vance run. They saw the paw prints, and they saw something else, a figure standing at the edge of the cotton field, silhouetted against the lightening sky. A woman in a red dress. 7 wolves arrayed around her like an honor guard. "Lord, have mercy," someone whispered. "That's her. That's the Cherokee woman." The story had spread even here, carried by runaways who'd been freed from coffles, by traders who'd seen things they couldn't explain, by slave patrols who'd found their colleagues torn apart and their captives vanished. The Cherokee woman who hunted hunters. The Cherokee woman who the forest obeyed. The Cherokee woman who came for slavers in the night and left nothing but blood and bone and terror in her wake. In the big house, Henry Carver jerked awake to the sound of Vance pounding on his door and shouting about wolves. He grabbed the pistol from his nightstand, a beautiful percussion-cap revolver, custom-made in Philadelphia, and threw on a robe before yanking the door open. "What the hell are you—" "Wolves, sir! Giant ones! The dogs are dead and there's tracks everywhere and—" Vance's words tumbled over each other, his usual composure shattered. Carver pushed past him, moving to the window that overlooked the front lawn. The light was better now, dawn bleeding pink and orange across the horizon, and he could see clearly. The dead dogs, the tracks, and standing at the edge of his carefully manicured lawn, holding a bow with an arrow nocked, the Cherokee woman. She was smaller than he'd imagined based on the stories, maybe 5'10", slender but corded with muscle visible even at this distance. Her face was painted in patterns that hurt to look at directly, red and white and black, in designs that seemed to shift when he blinked. Her hair hung loose and wild, and around her the wolves waited, tongues lolling, eyes fixed on the house with predatory patience. "Get everyone armed," Carver said, his voice steady despite the ice water suddenly flooding his veins. "Everyone. Bring them to the house. We're going to end this right now." Blah. Within 15 minutes, 12 men had assembled in the front room. Vance, 2 assistant overseers, 4 white workers who handled the cotton press, and 5 slave catchers who'd been staying on the property between jobs. all armed with rifles or shotguns, all experienced with violence, all wearing expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely concealed fear. "She's one woman," Carver said, loading his own rifle now, a Pennsylvania long gun that had dropped deer at 200 yards. "One woman and some big wolves. We have numbers, we have superior position, and we have right on our side. She's killed white men, destroyed property, disrupted commerce. She's a murderer and a criminal, and we're going to execute justice." He didn't mention the $5,000 bounty. He didn't need to. Every man in the room knew the number, knew what it could buy. They filed out onto the veranda, rifles bristling like porcupine quills. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the mist, revealing Ahyoka standing exactly where she'd been, unmoving as a statue. The wolves had spread out into a loose semicircle, blocking any direct approach. "You're on my property!" Carver shouted, his voice carrying across the lawn. "You're trespassing, and you're wanted for murder. Surrender now, and I promise you'll get a fair trial." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. If she surrendered, she'd be hanged within the week, probably tortured first for information about where she'd hidden freed slaves. But the forms had to be observed, the pretense of civilization maintained. Ahyoka raised her bow smoothly, drawing the string back to her cheek in one fluid motion. The arrow pointed directly at Carver's chest. "Samuel Hayes," she called back, her voice clear and cold. "That was my husband's name. He was a freed man. He had papers. Your employees took him anyway. They destroyed his papers. They tortured him for 3 days. They left his body for carrion birds." She paused, and even from 50 yards Carver could see her eyes, utterly calm, utterly certain. "You paid them to do this. You paid them to steal free black people and sell them south. You built your fortune on stolen lives and stolen labor. You sleep in comfort while people suffer in chains to make you rich. That's economics," Carver snapped back. "That's business. That's the natural order. Some people are meant to lead and prosper. Others are meant to serve. That's how God made the world. Then your God is a monster." Ahyoka's voice didn't rise, but somehow it carried more weight than Carver's shouting. "And monsters should be destroyed." She released the arrow. It covered 50 yards in less than a second, a streak of wood and feather that would have taken Carver directly through the heart if Vance hadn't tackled him at the last instant. The arrow buried itself in the doorframe behind where Carver had been standing, sinking 3 inches into solid oak. "Fire!" Vance screamed, and 12 rifles discharged in a ragged volley that turned the morning into thunder. But Ahyoka was already moving, dropping flat as the bullets chewed up the ground where she'd been standing. The wolves scattered, each one moving to predetermined positions with military precision. And then, before the men could reload, the counterattack began. 3 wolves came straight at the house, not charging blindly, but using the ornamental shrubs and decorative fountains for cover, moving in short bursts that made them nearly impossible to track. 4 more circled toward the sides, flanking positions that would let them attack from multiple angles, and Ahyoka herself vanished into the cotton field, using the rows for concealment, her red dress the only splash of color in a sea of white flowers and green leaves. "Reload! Reload, goddammit!" Carver was screaming now, the veneer of civilization stripped away to reveal raw panic underneath. His fingers fumbled with the powder horn, spilling black grains across the polished wood floor. One of the slave catchers, a man named Phillips, who'd killed at least 3 runaways over his career, stepped to the edge of the veranda, rifle raised, tracking one of the wolves. He got off a shot that made the animal yelp and stumble. Then an arrow came out of nowhere and took him through the eye, the force of impact snapping his head back and dropping him instantly. "Jesus! Jesus Christ, she's in the field! She's—" Another man, younger, his voice high with terror. He never finished the sentence. A second arrow caught him in the throat, and he went down gurgling and clawing at the shaft. The wolves hit the veranda then, 3 of them coming up the steps in a coordinated rush. Ghost led, his massive jaws closing on Vance's leg and dragging him screaming off the porch. The overseer managed one blast from his shotgun before teeth found his throat, and the screaming stopped in a wet crunch. Chaos erupted. Men were firing in all directions, hitting nothing, reloading frantically, or giving up, and pulling knives and pistols. The wolves were among them now, too fast and too close for rifles to be effective. One of the assistant overseers went down with his hamstrings severed. Another lost his face to claws that opened him from forehead to chin in one swipe. Carver backed toward the door, still fumbling with his rifle, his expensive robe soaked with sweat. He made it inside and slammed the door, throwing the bolt. Then he ran for the back of the house, for the servants' entrance, for any way out that didn't involve facing what was happening on his front lawn. He never made it. An arrow crashed through the French window in his bedroom, showering him with glass. Then another and another, each one forcing him to change direction, herding him like cattle toward the main staircase. He stumbled down the stairs, feet tangling in his robe, and when he looked up, Ahyoka was standing in his front hallway. She'd come through a window, had climbed the outside of his house like a spider, had been inside the whole time waiting for him. Up close, she was terrifying in a way the stories hadn't captured, not because of her face paint or her weapons, but because of her eyes. They held the absolute certainty of someone who'd moved beyond doubt or hesitation into a place where only action remained. "Please," Carver heard himself say, hating the weakness in his voice. "Please, I have money. I can pay you. I can—" "You have nothing I want," Ahyoka said quietly. She drew a knife from her belt, a simple tool with a blade made from traded steel. "Your money was stolen. Your land was stolen. Your entire life is built on theft and suffering. You asked what God wanted. I think God wants balance. I'll free them." Carver was backing toward the wall now, hands raised. "All of them. I'll sign the papers. You'll do nothing," Ahyoka interrupted, "because you'll be dead." She moved forward and Carver brought up his pistol. He'd forgotten he was still holding it, and fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, and the bullet took Ahyoka high in the left shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her against the wall. For 1 second, Carver thought he'd won. Then Ahyoka straightened, blood soaking her dress, and smiled. It was the most terrible thing he'd ever seen. "That should have killed you," he whispered. "I stopped being killable the day I buried my husband," she replied, and closed the distance between them. What happened next, no one would ever know in detail. The sounds that came from inside the house, screaming, breaking furniture, the wet sounds of violence, lasted about 5 minutes. Then silence fell, broken only by the ravens gathering in the trees and the soft whimpering of the wounded men scattered across the lawn. When the enslaved people from the quarters finally gathered the courage to approach the big house, moving as a group because there was safety in numbers, they found the front door open. Inside, Henry Carver lay at the base of his grand staircase, still alive but barely. He'd been stabbed 7 times, not enough to kill him instantly, but enough to ensure he'd bleed out slowly, painfully aware of what was happening. Ahyoka was sitting on the bottom step, holding her wounded shoulder. The wolves gathered around her like an honor guard. She looked at the crowd of people filling the doorway, men and women and children who'd lived their entire lives in bondage, who'd been bought and sold like cattle, who'd had families torn apart and dreams crushed under the machinery of commerce and cruelty. "You're free," she said simply. "The papers are in his office, upper right drawer. Destroy them or forge them or do whatever you need to prove you were always free. Take his money, take his horses, take anything that will help you survive. The roads north are being watched, but I've marked safe paths through the mountains." She stood slowly, wincing. "Go now, before more of them come." "What about you?" asked an older woman, someone who'd been on the plantation longer than anyone could remember, whose back was a road map of scars from Vance's whip. Ahyoka looked at Carver, still alive, still watching with eyes full of hate and pain and incomprehension. "I'm going to sit here and watch him die. It won't take long. Then I'm going back to the mountains. There are more men like him. There are always more men like him. They'll hunt you forever now," another voice said. "They'll never stop." Good, Ahyoka replied, and there was something like satisfaction in her voice. Let them come to the mountains. Let them come to the forest. Let them learn what it means to be hunted. She looked at the crowd again, her gaze softening slightly. But you need to be gone. You need to be so far from here that when they come asking questions, no one remembers your names. Understand? They understood. Within the hour, Carver's plantation was emptying like water from a broken dam. People took what they could carry: food, blankets, tools, weapons. They broke into the main house and found the strong box, divided the money equally. They set fire to the cotton press and the gin house, watching flames consume the machinery of their oppression. Someone found Carver's wine cellar and passed bottles around, drinking toasts to freedom they'd never thought they'd taste. By the time the smoke was visible from Chattanooga and the first authorities arrived, sheriff's deputies and slave patrols and bounty hunters, drawn by the sight of destruction, the formerly enslaved were long gone, scattered into the mountains along paths only Ahyoka knew, heading for the underground railroad stations she'd memorized, for safe houses run by Quakers and free blacks and conscientious whites who believed that slavery was an abomination. All that remained was the burned shell of Carver's empire, and in the middle of it, carved into the steps where she'd sat, more Cherokee words that would need John Ross to translate. The scales tip toward justice. The forest keeps score. And in the master bedroom, they found one more thing: Ahyoka's arrow, the one that had first announced her presence, driven deep into Carver's pillow. Tied to the shaft was a scrap of cloth torn from Samuel Hayes's Freedom Papers, the ones the Benson brothers had destroyed. The paper was stained with blood that had long since turned brown, but the signature at the bottom was still legible. Samuel Hayes, Freeman. It was a message, a declaration, a promise. The Cherokee woman was keeping score, and she was nowhere near finished settling accounts. Winter came early to the Smoky Mountains in 1842, bringing snow that buried the trails and ice that turned streams into glass. The cold should have slowed everything: the hunting, the killing, the spreading terror that had turned eastern Tennessee into a place where even hardened slave traders refused to travel after dark. But if anything, the killings accelerated. Bodies were found frozen to trees, arranged in patterns no one could interpret. Patrol camps were discovered burned out, the men inside dead from smoke or arrows or wolf bites, always with that same message carved nearby: the forest remembers. In Nashville, the state legislature convened an emergency session to address what the governor was calling the Cherokee insurgency. That was a sanitized term for what was really happening: a one-woman war against the slave trade that had claimed at least 40 lives and freed hundreds of enslaved people. Plantation owners were terrified. Traders refused to move cargo through the eastern counties. The economy of suffering that had made Tennessee rich was grinding to a halt, and powerful men wanted something done about it. They raised the bounty to $10,000. They put out wanted posters with a description so vague it could have matched half the Cherokee women still living in the state. Dark hair, dark eyes, approximately 5'10", often seen wearing red clothing. Armed and extremely dangerous, travels with wolves. They organized militias, professional hunting parties, even tried bringing in federal troops before cooler heads explained that deploying the army against one woman would be a national embarrassment. Nothing worked. Ahyoka had become a ghost, appearing only to kill and then vanishing back into her mountains like smoke. The few who survived encounters with her reported the same things: the preternatural speed, the impossible accuracy with a bow, the wolves that fought like they could read her mind. Some claimed she could become invisible, or turn into an animal herself, or summon storms. The line between reality and myth blurred until no one knew what to believe. But Ahyoka was very much human and very much wounded. The bullet Carver had put in her shoulder had shattered bone and torn muscle, and despite the medicine she'd learned from her grandmother, poultices and teas and compounds that would have made a frontier doctor weep, it wasn't healing right. She could still draw a bow, but the pain was constant, and her left arm had lost perhaps 20% of its strength. In a fight against normal men with normal weapons, it didn't matter. In a fight against serious opposition, it could be fatal. She knew her time was limited. The mountains had sheltered her through autumn and into winter, but spring would bring fresh hunters, new tactics, overwhelming force. She'd done what she set out to do, made the slave trade unprofitable in eastern Tennessee, freed as many people as she could, punished the men most directly responsible for Samuel's death. But the system itself remained intact, grinding up human lives with mechanical efficiency, and one woman with wolves couldn't destroy it no matter how much blood she spilled. Ghost sensed her thoughts, the way he always did now. The bond between them had deepened over the months of hunting and killing until it felt less like a human commanding an animal and more like two parts of a single consciousness. He pressed his massive head against her leg, and she scratched behind his ears absently. They were camped in a cave system high in the mountains, miles from the nearest settlement. The 6 other wolves, she'd lost one in a fight with a particularly well-organized patrol, were sleeping near the entrance, forming a living barrier between her and the outside world. A small fire burned in the cave's center, fed with dead wood that produced almost no smoke. Meat from a deer she'd killed yesterday hung drying on racks made from branches. It was Spartan, isolated, and utterly alien to the life she'd once imagined for herself. She'd wanted to be a blacksmith's wife, to have children, to grow old watching grandchildren play in the yard while Samuel worked the forge and she tended a garden. Simple dreams, impossible dreams, in a world that saw her people as obstacles to removal and his people as property to be exploited. A sound from the cave entrance made her reach for her bow. Ghost rose instantly, lips pulled back from teeth that could crush bone. But it wasn't danger. It was John Ross, picking his way carefully through the narrow entrance, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "I came alone," he said quietly. "And I came in peace, Ahyoka. I need to speak with you." She lowered the bow but didn't relax her grip. "How did you find me?" "I've known these mountains longer than you've been alive," Ross replied. He was wearing heavy furs against the cold, and his breath fogged in the frigid air. "I helped your grandmother hide from the soldiers during the removal. She told me about certain places, certain caves where the old medicine was strongest. I've been looking for you for 3 months. May I sit?" Ahyoka gestured to a flat rock near the fire. Ross settled himself with the careful movements of a man feeling his age, extending his hands toward the flames for warmth. "They sent you to negotiate," Ahyoka said. "It wasn't a question. No one sent me. I came because I'm worried about you, and because I think you're about to do something that will get you killed while accomplishing nothing. I've accomplished quite a bit. You've killed slavers and freed enslaved people, yes. You've disrupted the trade routes and cost the planters a fortune. You've become a legend that will be talked about for generations." Ross looked at her directly. "But the system remains. The laws remain, the violence remains, and now they're organizing something that will overwhelm even you." Ahyoka fed another branch to the fire. "Let them come." "They're not coming to the mountains," Ross said. "They're smarter than that now. They've figured out that you're essentially unbeatable on your own territory, so they're changing the battlefield." He pulled a folded newspaper from inside his coat and passed it to her. "This was published in Nashville 4 days ago." The headline made her blood run cold. "Cherokee settlement at Chota Creek to be evacuated." The article explained that due to security concerns related to recent criminal activity, all Cherokee people still living in eastern Tennessee would be forcibly relocated west to join the main body of the tribe in Indian Territory. The evacuation was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, would be conducted by federal troops, and any resistance would be met with lethal force. "They're using you as an excuse," Ross said quietly. "They're saying that as long as Cherokees remain in Tennessee, there will be insurgency and violence. The only solution is complete removal. That settlement at Chota Creek, there are maybe 60 people there, families, children, old ones who survived the Trail of Tears once and can't survive it again. They're being punished for what you've done." Ahyoka's hands were shaking. She laid the newspaper aside carefully before she tore it apart. "This is extortion. This is what they do. They take what we love and use it as leverage. They know you won't let innocent people suffer because of your actions." Ross leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Surrender, Ahyoka. Turn yourself in. I'll make sure you get a trial, make sure they don't just hang you in the street. There are lawyers, good people who'll argue your case. Maybe—" "There is no maybe," Ahyoka interrupted. "You know that. They'll hang me regardless. And then they'll still relocate the settlement, because it was never about me. It's about taking the last pieces of land we have left." "Then what do you propose?" Ahyoka was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. The wolves had gathered now, forming a semicircle behind her, their eyes reflecting flame light like demons. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as if she was calculating logistics rather than planning suicide. "The settlement has 2 weeks before the troops arrive. In 2 weeks I can get them out. Get them north into Virginia, maybe even as far as Pennsylvania. There are still Cherokee communities there, people who'll take them in. I know the routes. I've been using them to move freed slaves. It'll work for our own people too." "The military will stop you," Ross said. "They're watching the roads, the passes. They're expecting exactly this. The military watches roads. I use game trails and creek beds. I travel by night and hide by day. I can move 60 people the same way I've moved 200 slaves." She looked at Ross directly. "But I'll need help. Supplies. Guides who know the northern routes better than I do. And I'll need someone to spread word that I've surrendered, that I'm coming in. Keep the authorities looking in the wrong direction while we move." Ross was shaking his head before she finished. "This is insane. Even if you get them out of Tennessee, they'll hunt you forever. There's nowhere in this country you'll be safe. The federal government doesn't forget. The bounty won't expire." "I know," Ahyoka said simply. "But those 60 people will live. Their children will grow up free. That's worth the cost." "It's worth your life. My life ended the day Samuel died. Everything since has been borrowed time." She stood, moving to the cave entrance, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "I'm not asking for approval, John. I'm asking for help. Will you give it?" The old man was quiet for a long time, his weathered face reflecting years of impossible choices, of survival purchased through compromise, of watching his people diminish year by year while he did everything he could to preserve what little remained. Finally he nodded. "I'll help, God help me, I'll help. But Ahyoka, when this is over, when those people are safe, you need to run. Don't make a last stand, don't go down fighting, just run and keep running. Maybe go to Canada, maybe disappear into the Western Territories, but live. You owe Samuel that much. To live." Ahyoka didn't answer. She'd stopped making promises she couldn't keep. Over the next 2 weeks, a carefully orchestrated deception unfolded across eastern Tennessee. Word spread that Ahyoka had been wounded, was hiding somewhere near Gatlinburg, was ready to negotiate surrender. Sheriff's deputies and bounty hunters converged on the area, setting up checkpoints and search patterns. The newspapers breathlessly reported every rumor, every supposed sighting. All eyes turned toward the central mountains. Meanwhile, 60 Cherokee people from the Chota Creek settlement packed what they could carry and prepared for a journey they'd prayed never to make again. Most were elders, people too old or too sick to have survived the first removal, who'd hidden in caves and hollows until the soldiers gave up searching. They remembered the Trail of Tears, the cold, the hunger, the bodies left by the roadside, the way the government had promised protection and delivered death. They'd sworn never to leave their homeland again, but they recognized necessity when they saw it. Ahyoka came to them on a night when the moon was dark, 7 wolves at her back, and a confidence in her bearing that made even the skeptical believe they might actually survive this. She'd planned the route down to the smallest detail, had cached supplies along the way, had arranged for guides to meet them at specific points. She'd thought of everything except her own survival, which was tellingly absent from all her planning. They left on a night when snow was falling, using the weather as cover. 60 people moving silently through the forest in small groups, children carried on backs, elderly helped by the young. Ahyoka ranged ahead with the wolves, scouting, making sure the way was clear. They traveled by night and sheltered by day in caves she'd already prepared, with firewood stacked and water nearby. It was brutal, exhausting, dangerous, but it was methodical. On the 4th night they encountered a patrol, 6 men on horseback, moving along a ridge Ahyoka had hoped would be clear. They were half drunk, complaining about the cold, clearly not expecting to find anything. But they had the bad luck to be in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment. Ahyoka watched them from cover, calculating. She could take them with the wolves, but it would make noise. Noise would bring more patrols. More patrols would mean discovery. Discovery would mean failure. She made her decision. Moving silently through the trees, she worked her way above the patrol to a spot where the ridge narrowed and one side dropped away into a ravine. She waited until they were directly below, then started a rock slide. Just a few stones at first, then more, then an avalanche of snow and ice and stone that sent horses screaming and men tumbling into the dark. By the time the survivors, there were 2, managed to climb back to the trail, bruised and terrified, the Cherokee group was miles away and the wolves had obliterated their tracks. They crossed into Virginia on the 8th day, and Ahyoka felt something in her chest loosen fractionally. They weren't safe yet, but they were out of Tennessee, out of the immediate jurisdiction of the men who wanted them dead or relocated. 2 more days brought them to the first way station, a Quaker family who'd been helping runaways for 20 years and didn't blink at adding 60 Cherokee refugees to their roster of people who'd never officially existed. From here, others will take you, Ahyoka told the settlement's leader, a woman named Martha who'd taught her beadwork when Ahyoka was a child. They know the routes north, the safe places. Some of you might make it to Canada. Others might settle in New York or Pennsylvania, but you'll live. Your children will live. What about you? Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. I'm going back. There's still work to do. Ahyoka managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Someone needs to keep them looking in the wrong direction until you're far enough away that it doesn't matter. This is suicide. This is accounting, Ahyoka corrected. Balancing books that have been skewed for too long. She left that night, the wolves following, heading back toward the mountains that had become her kingdom and her prison. Behind her, 60 people continued north toward uncertain freedom. Ahead of her, an entire state was mobilizing to hunt one woman. The odds were impossible. The outcome was foregone. But Ahyoka had stopped caring about survival somewhere around the time she'd carved the first message into a tree. She cared about impact. She cared about making them remember. She cared about justice, even if justice meant her own destruction. The wolves howled as they ran south, a sound like wind through a canyon, like grief given voice, like vengeance made manifest. And deep in the Tennessee mountains, slave traders heard that howling and felt ice water replace the blood in their veins. The Cherokee woman was coming back. And she was done running. The spring thaw of 1842 turned the mountain trails to mud and filled the creeks with snowmelt, and with the water came fresh blood. Ahyoka returned to Tennessee like a fever, appearing in 3 different counties in the same week, leaving destruction that defied geographical possibility. A slave coffle ambushed near Knoxville, the traders found with their throats opened and their cargo vanished. A patrol camp outside Chattanooga, discovered at dawn, empty except for 6 bodies arranged in a circle, and a 7th man left alive but raving about wolves the size of horses. A plantation owner in Maryville, who specialized in breaking newly enslaved people, found hanging from his own gallows the noose tied by someone who understood knots far too well. The authorities were frantic, divided, increasingly desperate. Some argued for overwhelming force, send in the army, burn the forests if necessary, kill everything that moved, until the Cherokee woman was found. Others counseled negotiation, suggesting that if they could discover what she wanted, perhaps an accommodation could be reached. Still others, quietly and only in private conversations, wondered if perhaps she had a point. That last group was small but growing. The violence of slavery had always been present, always been part of the social fabric, but it had been largely invisible to white society. Something that happened in the fields, in the slave quarters, out of sight of polite company. Ahyoka had made it visible. She dragged it out of the shadows and forced people to look at what their economy was built on. Every body she left, every message she carved, was a mirror held up to a society that preferred not to examine itself too closely. In the mountains, Ahyoka was dying. Not dramatically, not in any single moment of violence, but slowly and with grinding certainty. The shoulder wound from Carver had never healed properly and had become infected. She burned with fever some nights, shivering despite the fire. The wolves pressed close, trying to share their warmth. She could still fight, could still draw the bow, still move with lethal speed when necessary, but it was taking more effort, requiring more will to push through the pain. She knew she didn't have long, weeks, maybe a month if she was fortunate. The infection would kill her long before any bounty hunter got close, but she intended to use every day she had left, every hour, to extract maximum cost from the system that had taken everything from her. Ghost knew something was wrong. The great wolf stayed closer now, his eyes worried in a way that would have been comical if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. The other 6 wolves sensed it too, their behavior changing subtly, becoming more protective, more aggressive toward any potential threat. On a cold morning in late March, with frost still clinging to the pine needles, despite the calendar insisting spring had arrived, Ahyoka woke to find a visitor sitting by her fire. She'd grown careless, or perhaps her body was simply giving out because she hadn't heard him approach, and neither had the wolves who should have been on guard. The visitor was a black man, perhaps 40, with grey threading his short hair and a face that had weathered more hardships than any face should have to endure. He wore simple traveler's clothes and carried a walking stick, and he radiated a kind of calm authority that made the wolves hesitate rather than attack immediately. "Easy," he said softly, not to Ahyoka but to Ghost, who was tense to spring. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. My name is Thomas. I've come a long way to speak with you." Ahyoka sat up slowly, reaching for her knife, but not yet drawing it. "How did you find me?" "I followed the stories, listened to what people said about where you'd been, where you'd struck next, looked for the patterns." "I'm good with patterns." Thomas smiled slightly. "Also, a Cherokee friend of yours named John Ross might have pointed me in a general direction. Why are you here?" "Because I run part of the Underground Railroad, and you've become a problem." He said it without malice, stating a fact. "Don't misunderstand what you're doing, the people you're freeing. It's righteous work, but it's also chaotic. You're freeing folks without teaching them the roots, without connecting them to the network. Some of them are getting caught again. Some are dying out there because they don't know where to go or who to trust." Ahyoka felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How many?" "Of the people you've freed, maybe half make it north. The other half either get recaptured or die trying. That's not your fault. You're doing the best you can with what you have. But it could be better. It should be better." Thomas leaned forward. "I want to coordinate with you. Share routes, share contacts. Make sure that when you free people, they have a real chance. Why should I trust you? because I've been doing this for 15 years, and in that time, I've moved over 300 people to freedom with a success rate above 90%, because I've risked my life more times than I can count, been shot twice, had my family threatened, and kept going because this is the most important work in the world. And because... He gestured at her shoulder, at the way she was holding herself, the slight tremor in her hands. You're dying, and when you're gone, all this knowledge dies with you unless you pass it on. The bluntness of it was almost refreshing. Ahyoka found herself laughing, a harsh sound that turned into coughing that left her spitting blood into the fire. You're not wrong, she admitted when she could speak again, about any of it. What do you propose? Over the next several hours, as the sun climbed and the frost melted, Thomas and Ahyoka planned. He had maps, incredible, detailed maps showing safe houses from Tennessee to Canada, routes that avoided major roads and patrol points, contacts in every state. She had intimate knowledge of eastern Tennessee's geography, could describe every trail and cave system, knew which areas were heavily patrolled and which were effectively unguarded. Together, they created something new, a system that combined her guerrilla tactics with his established network. She would continue to free people, but now she'd funnel them to specific locations where Thomas's people would be waiting. He'd provide supplies, documents, guides. She'd provide the initial liberation and the brutal deterrence that kept slavers afraid to operate in the region. This could work, Thomas said, as afternoon shadows lengthened. This could actually change things on a scale beyond what either of us could do alone. If I live long enough, Ahyoka pointed out. If you live long enough, Thomas agreed, which is why I brought you this. He pulled a small bottle from his coat, filled with liquid that looked like muddy water. Medicine from a root doctor down in Alabama. Best healer I've ever met. She said if I described your symptoms right, this should help with the infection. Won't cure you, but might buy you time. Ahyoka took the bottle, held it up to the light. Why would you waste this on me? You could use it for your own people. You are my people, Thomas said simply. Anyone fighting this evil is my people, regardless of what color they are or what language they speak. We're all bleeding from the same wound. Only difference is some of us are trying to heal it while others keep cutting deeper. She drank the medicine that night, and whether through its properties or simple willpower, the fever broke. The infection didn't disappear entirely, but it stabilized, stopped spreading. She felt stronger, clearer, like someone had removed a fog that had been clouding her thoughts. True to his word, Thomas established connections throughout eastern Tennessee. Suddenly, when Ahyoka freed a group of enslaved people, they didn't wander blindly north hoping for salvation. They went to specific houses, met specific people, followed specific routes that had been tested and proven. The success rate jumped dramatically. Within weeks, dozens of people who would have died or been recaptured were instead making their way to freedom. But success bred attention. The planters and traders, already terrified of Ahyoka, now began to suspect she wasn't working alone. They started interrogating free blacks more aggressively, watching suspected Underground Railroad operators, offering rewards for information. Thomas had to move several of his safe houses when they became compromised. 2 of his conductors were arrested, though they revealed nothing under questioning. They're closing in, Thomas warned during one of their meetings in a cave system they'd begun using as a headquarters. Not just on you, on the whole network. They're getting smarter, more coordinated. We need to be ready for them to try something big. That something came on a warm night in April, when spring had finally pushed winter fully back, and the dogwoods were blooming white as snow throughout the mountains. Ahyoka was moving a group of 12 people, men, women, 3 children, toward a safe house near the Virginia border. It should have been routine. The route was well established, the safe house was reliable, and she'd made this run a dozen times without incident. But someone had talked. Or someone had been watching, or someone had simply gotten lucky with a guess about where she'd be. However it happened, when Ahyoka emerged from a creek bed onto a ridge trail, she found herself facing not a patrol, but an army. 50 men, all armed with rifles, spread out in a semicircle, blocking any escape. They had dogs, lanterns, and an officer in a federal uniform who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and at the center of the formation, looking satisfied in a way that made Ahyoka's blood boil, was a man she recognized from wanted posters. Thomas Calloway, the most successful slave catcher in 3 states, a man who'd made a fortune returning runaways to bondage. "Miss Hayes," Calloway called out, using Samuel's last name like a weapon. Or should I say Mrs. Hayes, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Behind Ahyoka, the 12 freed people were frozen in terror. The children began to cry. The wolves growled, a sound like distant thunder, but even Ghost could count. 7 wolves against 50 armed men wasn't a fight. It was a massacre. "Let them go," Ahyoka said, gesturing to the people behind her. "They're not part of this. Your bounty is on me, not them." "Actually, there's a reward for returning escaped slaves too," Calloway said. "Smaller, certainly, but money is money. We'll be taking every one." He raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at her chest. "You can surrender peacefully, or we can shoot you and take them anyway. Your choice." Ahyoka's mind raced, calculating angles, counting seconds, looking for any possible escape. There was none. The ridge was too exposed, the forest too far. If she ran, they'd shoot her in the back. If she fought, they'd kill the wolves and probably execute the freed people just to make a point. If she surrendered, she'd hang, and those 12 people would be dragged back to the plantations they'd risked everything to escape. There were no good choices. There were only choices about how to die and what to die for. She reached for her bow, knowing it was futile, knowing the bullets would reach her long before her arrow reached Calloway, but unable to simply surrender. Samuel had surrendered. Samuel had showed them his papers and asked for justice, and died screaming. She would not repeat his mistake. The first shot came not from Calloway's rifle, but from somewhere in the trees to the left, a crack of sound that dropped one of the men before anyone realized what was happening. Then another shot, and another, a disciplined volley from multiple positions that sent the organized formation into chaos. Thomas and his people had come. 20 conductors of the Underground Railroad, free blacks and abolitionist whites, who'd decided that tonight was the night for choosing sides, who'd followed at a distance knowing Ahyoka might need help. They couldn't match the bounty hunters' numbers, but they had surprise and position and absolute commitment. "Run!" Thomas's voice echoed from the trees. "Get them out of here." Ahyoka didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest child and started moving, the wolves forming a protective circle around the group. Behind her, the ridge exploded into violence. Gunfire and shouting, men running and dying, the night turned into screaming chaos. She heard Calloway bellowing orders, heard the federal officer trying to restore discipline, heard Thomas's voice raised in a war cry that should have been terrifying but sounded like hope. They made it to the tree line, then into the forest proper, then down into a ravine where the darkness was absolute and pursuit would be nearly impossible. The freed people were gasping, terrified, clutching each other. The children were sobbing, but they were moving, putting distance between themselves and the fight. Ghost appeared beside her, blood on his muzzle but otherwise unhurt. 5 of the other wolves followed. 2 were missing, probably dead in the fighting. Ahyoka felt their loss like physical wounds, but there was no time to grieve. They had miles to cover before dawn, and behind them she could still hear gunfire, could still hear men dying for the simple principle that some people deserve to be free. They reached the safe house 3 hours later, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. Thomas arrived near dawn, supported by 2 of his people, bleeding from a wound in his side but grinning like a madman. "We held them," he said, collapsing near the fireplace. "Held them long enough. Killed maybe a dozen, wounded more. They retreated. We won." "You won a battle," Ahyoka corrected. "The war continues. Then we'll fight the next battle too," Thomas replied. "And the one after that, for as long as it takes, for as long as we're breathing." Looking at him, at this man who'd risked everything, who'd brought his people into a fight that wasn't directly theirs, who'd chosen humanity over safety, Ahyoka felt something she hadn't felt since Samuel died. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too easily broken, but purpose, continuation, the sense that even when she was gone, the work would continue, that she was part of something larger than revenge or grief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank me by staying alive," Thomas replied. "We need you. Your people need you. History needs you." But history had other plans, as it often does, and those plans were about to converge in a way no one could have predicted. The summer of 1842 brought heat that turned the mountains into a furnace and news that traveled faster than any fire. President Tyler, under pressure from southern states threatening secession if slavery wasn't protected from terrorist attacks, had authorized the deployment of 300 federal troops to eastern Tennessee. Their mission was simple: capture or kill the Cherokee woman and dismantle the Underground Railroad network operating in the region. No trials, no questions asked, just results. The commanding officer was a colonel named Marcus Bellamy, a veteran of the Seminole Wars, who'd earned his reputation putting down rebellions and didn't distinguish much between different kinds of hostile natives. He arrived in Knoxville with orders to treat the situation as a military operation, which meant roads blockaded, houses searched, anyone suspected of helping Ahyoka arrested without warrant. "We're going to burn her out," he announced at his first strategy meeting with local authorities. "Destroy the caves she uses for shelter, poison the streams, clear-cut the forests if necessary, make the mountains uninhabitable. She has to eat, has to drink, has to sleep somewhere. We remove those options, and she either surrenders or dies of exposure. Either way, the problem is solved." Sheriff Pritchard, who'd been chasing Ahyoka for over a year without success, felt obligated to object. "Colonel, with respect, those are our mountains. People hunt there, log there, use those trails for legitimate business. If you burn them, the economic impact of this insurgency already outweighs any logging revenue," Bellamy interrupted. "The governor agrees. The president agrees. This ends now, regardless of cost." And so began the campaign that would later be taught in military academies as an example of how to fail spectacularly while appearing to succeed. Bellamy's troops moved into the mountains in force, burning caves, destroying known campsites, arresting anyone who couldn't immediately prove they had no connection to the Underground Railroad. They were thorough, professional, and completely ineffective. Ahyoka and her wolves stayed one step ahead of every sweep, warned by a network of sympathizers that had grown larger than anyone realized. Cherokee families who'd lost everything in the removal watched troop movements and lit signal fires. Enslaved people working plantation fields near military camps overheard plans and passed them along through coded songs. Even some white settlers, disgusted by the heavy-handed tactics, started providing information about where soldiers were headed. For every cave Bellamy destroyed, Ahyoka used 2 others. For every stream he poisoned, she knew 3 more. And the more visible and violent the military became, the more support she gained from people who'd previously been neutral. Nothing radicalizes quite like watching federal troops burn your hunting grounds and arrest your neighbors without cause. But the pressure was mounting. Resources were finite. Safe houses were being discovered and shut down. Thomas's network was taking losses it couldn't sustain. And Ahyoka herself was weakening, not from the shoulder infection, which had stabilized, but from simple exhaustion. A human body can only sustain that level of stress for so long before it begins breaking down in ways no medicine can fix. She was sitting by a fire in yet another temporary camp, trying to eat venison that tasted like ash in her mouth, when Ghost suddenly raised his head and growled low. Not the aggressive growl of imminent attack, but the uncertain rumble of something unexpected. A moment later, John Ross emerged from the darkness, moving carefully with his hands visible. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble, and you're not going to like what I have to say. They talked until dawn. Ross explained that he'd been in secret negotiations with federal authorities for weeks, trying to find a solution that didn't end with Ahyoka's death and more Cherokee removal. He'd made a proposal, and incredibly, it had been accepted. They'll grant amnesty, Ross said. Full pardon for all crimes committed. The bounty will be rescinded. The federal troops will withdraw, and in exchange, you leave. Not west to Indian Territory, they know you'd never survive the journey in your condition, but north to Canada. They'll provide safe passage, will guarantee no interference. You cross into Canada and you're free, actually free. Ahyoka stared at him. Why would they agree to this? Because you've become more valuable as a symbol than as a corpse, Ross explained. Killing you would make you a martyr. Chasing you forever is expensive and embarrassing. But if you voluntarily leave, if you accept exile, then they can declare victory. They can say they drove you out of the country, that American justice prevailed. They get their propaganda win. You get to live. Everyone gets something. And the Underground Railroad, Thomas and his people? Separate issue. They'll continue operating. The authorities will continue trying to shut them down. That struggle predates you and will continue after you. But at least they won't have federal troops burning the countryside looking for you. Ahyoka was silent for a long time, watching the fire burn down to coals. Everything in her recoiled from the idea of running, of accepting exile, of letting them win. But she was tired. Tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion into something spiritual. And she thought of the 60 Cherokee people she'd saved, now living free in the north. Of the hundreds of enslaved people who'd escaped to freedom through her actions, of Thomas and his network who would continue the fight. Maybe survival was its own form of victory. Maybe living to tell the story was more important than dying to finish it. I need to talk to Thomas, she said finally, get his opinion. Thomas, when they met 2 days later, was characteristically blunt. Take the deal. Don't be stupid about this. But the work will continue without you. Ahyoka, you've done more in 1 year than most people do in a lifetime. You've freed hundreds, killed dozens of slavers, disrupted an entire state's economy, inspired people across the country. But you're not immortal, and you're not irreplaceable. He softened his tone. The railroad existed before you, and will exist after you. What you've given us, the fear you've put in slavers, the hope you've given enslaved people, the proof that resistance is possible, that's permanent. That doesn't leave just because you do. What about you? What about your network? We'll adapt, we always do. And honestly, it'll be easier without federal troops tearing up the countryside looking for you. Thomas grinned. I'm not saying we want you gone. I'm saying we want you alive more than we want you here. The decision was made, though it felt like surrender. Ahyoka would accept exile. She'd leave Tennessee, leave the mountains that had sheltered her, leave the graves of her husband and her people. She'd go north into Canada and, what? Live somehow, build a new life. The future was an abstraction she couldn't quite imagine. The journey was arranged with surprising efficiency. Federal authorities, eager to declare victory, provided an escort, not to arrest her but to protect her from bounty hunters who hadn't gotten word the hunt was over. John Ross traveled with her, and Thomas arranged for Underground Railroad conductors to manage logistics along the route. They left on a morning in early August, when the heat was already oppressive and cicadas screamed in the trees. The wolves came too, all 5 survivors of her original 7, plus Ghost, who'd become something more than an animal and less than human, bound to her in ways that transcended normal pack dynamics. The route took them north through Virginia and Maryland, into Pennsylvania and New York, each day bringing them closer to the border and further from everything Ahyoka had known. They passed through towns where people lined the streets to see the Cherokee woman who'd terrorized slavers, where some threw stones and others threw flowers, where the response was never neutral. In Pennsylvania, they stopped at a safe house run by Quakers, and Ahyoka met some of the people she'd freed months ago. They'd found work, found families, found ways to build lives in freedom. Seeing them thriving felt like justification, like proof that the blood and violence had accomplished something beyond revenge. In New York, Thomas said goodbye. "This is as far as I go," he explained. "Work waiting for me back south, people to free. You understand?" "I understand." Ahyoka embraced him, this man who'd become a brother in all but blood. "Thank you for everything." "Thank Samuel when you see him again," Thomas replied. "He started this by being brave enough to believe in freedom. You just finished what he began." The border crossing happened on a cool morning in late September, with fall colors just beginning to paint the trees. Canadian authorities were waiting. They'd been notified in advance, had agreed to accept Ahyoka as a political refugee. The federal troops who'd escorted her this far stopped at the border marker, their job complete. John Ross was the last to say goodbye. "Build a new life," he said. "Have children if you can. Teach them about Samuel, about your grandmother, about what you did and why. Make sure the story survives even if we don't. What will you tell people about what happened to me?" Ross smiled. "I'll tell them the truth, that you fought impossible odds and survived, that you gave everything for justice and somehow didn't lose yourself, that the mountains remember you, and so do we." He paused. "And I'll tell them that sometimes the bravest thing isn't dying for what you believe in, but living with what you've done." Ahyoka crossed into Canada with her wolves, leaving behind a country that had taken everything from her and somehow failed to take her spirit. Behind her, Tennessee began the slow process of forgetting, erasing her from official records, minimizing her impact, turning her into rumor and ghost story. Within a generation, historians would debate whether she'd even existed or was just propaganda, myth, a cautionary tale invented to keep enslaved people passive. But in the slave quarters throughout the South, a different story was told. They spoke of the Cherokee woman and her wolves, of how she'd hunted the hunters, of how she'd made the forest a sanctuary and the night a weapon. They whispered her name like a prayer, Ahyoka. She brings happiness, not in the way her parents had hoped when they named her, but in the fierce joy of seeing oppressors punished, of knowing that somewhere someone had fought back and survived. Ahyoka settled in a small community north of Toronto, where other Cherokee who'd fled removal had established themselves. She was 26 years old and felt ancient. She'd killed at least 40 men, freed perhaps 500 people, and seen things that would have broken most humans. She was also, improbably, alive. The wolves stayed with her, though Ghost grew old quickly. The medicine that had changed him had extracted a cost. He died 2 years after they crossed the border, and Ahyoka buried him in a clearing that reminded her of the Smoky Mountains. The other wolves eventually wandered away, called back to wildness once the bond of warfare no longer held them. She let them go without sorrow. They'd earned their freedom as much as she had. She never married again. Samuel had been the love of her life, and that chapter was closed, but she taught Cherokee children their language, told stories of the old ways, kept culture alive in exile the way her grandmother had tried to do. And on certain nights, when the wind was right and the moon was high, she'd walk into the forest and sing, not mourning songs, but war chants, not grief, but defiance, not surrender, but continuation. In Tennessee, the slave trade resumed, though never quite at its previous volume. The roads through the eastern mountains remained dangerous, and even years after Ahyoka's departure, traders reported seeing wolves where no wolves should be, hearing Cherokee songs on the wind, finding old campsites marked with familiar words. The forest remembers. Sheriff Marcus Pritchard died of a stroke in 1847, having never captured the woman who'd haunted his jurisdiction. Colonel Bellamy was reassigned to Western Territories, where he continued failing to suppress indigenous resistance until an Apache arrow ended his career and life in 1853. The bounty on Ahyoka's head was never formally rescinded, but no one attempted to collect it. Some legends are too powerful to kill, even when the person behind them has long since moved on. Thomas continued running the Underground Railroad until the Civil War broke out, at which point he enlisted and fought with the United States colored troops. He survived the war and lived to see emancipation, dying peacefully in 1873 at the age of 71. In his final years, he told stories about the Cherokee woman he'd fought beside, embellishing slightly each time until it was hard to separate truth from legend. But the core remained. She'd been real, she'd been fierce, and she'd mattered. John Ross continued as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation through the Civil War and beyond, navigating impossible politics and managing to preserve some measure of Cherokee sovereignty against overwhelming pressure. He died in 1866 in Washington, D.C., still fighting for his people. Among his personal effects was a bow, simple, well-made, carved with symbols in the old style. No one knew where he'd gotten it, and he'd never explained. But those who'd known Ahyoka recognized the craftsmanship instantly. In Canada, Ahyoka lived to be 63 years old. Old by the standards of her time, ancient by the standards of people who'd lived through what she'd survived. She died in her sleep in 1879, surrounded by students who'd learned Cherokee traditions from her, by children she'd helped raise, by a community that had become her family in the absence of bloodkin. At her funeral, someone produced a fiddle and played Cherokee songs mixed with hymns, and the combination shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. They buried her in the clearing where Ghost lay, under a marker that bore only her name and dates, nothing about what she'd done or what she'd survived. The story would live on through telling, through whispers, through the oral histories that preserve truth better than any monument. And on nights when the wind comes down through the Ontario forests in a certain way, people still claim to hear it, not quite howling, not quite singing, somewhere between grief and triumph. They call it the ghost wind, the Cherokee wind, the sound of justice that arrived too late, but arrived nonetheless. In the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, where Ahyoka once hunted and fought and bled, the trees still carry scars, words carved by a woman who refused to be forgotten, who turned pain into purpose and loss into legacy. Most of the carvings have weathered away, bark grown over and time erasing what human hands created, but a few remain, deep enough that no amount of growth can fully hide them. The forest remembers, they say in Cherokee, and it does. The enslaved people who walked the paths she protected, who tasted freedom because she made it possible, became grandparents and great-grandparents, who told stories to children, who told stories to their children. The narrative evolved. She became taller. The wolves became bigger. The body count increased. But the essential truth remained. A Cherokee woman named Ahyoka had loved a black man named Samuel, had lost him to violence, and had responded with such fury that an entire state had trembled. They called her savage. The enslaved called her deliverance. The mountains remembered her as the Avenger. And in the end, perhaps the most radical thing she did was survive. Not just physically, though that was miracle enough, but surviving with her humanity intact, her compassion preserved, her capacity for hope not entirely extinguished. She'd stared into the abyss of human cruelty, had participated in violence that would have destroyed most souls, and came out the other side still capable of teaching children, still able to love, still human. The lesson of Ahyoka isn't that violence solves problems. The slave system continued for another 2 decades after her exile, sustained by structures far more powerful than any individual could destroy. The lesson is that resistance matters, that fighting back, even when the odds are impossible, creates ripples that spread farther than any one person can see. That choosing to stand against evil, knowing you'll probably lose, is still worth doing because the alternative is collaboration through silence. She was one woman. She changed nothing if you measure change only in laws and systems. She changed everything if you measure change in hearts and stories and the inspiration that makes future resistance possible. The wolf howls have faded from the Tennessee mountains now, replaced by highways and housing developments and the general noise of progress. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is high, hikers report hearing something that makes them pause. Not quite animal, not quite human, somewhere between mourning and celebration. The forest remembers, and perhaps in remembering, it teaches us something essential about justice and love and the price we pay for both. Ahyoka paid that price in full, in blood and exile and decades of grief, but she paid it on her own terms, which might be the most freedom anyone can truly achieve. The story ends, as all stories must, but the song continues, passed from voice to voice, generation to generation, a melody of rage and righteousness that refuses to be silenced. They called her the Avenger, and they were right.